We're going to talk tonight about images from the age of anxiety, teaching about the Cold War, 1946 to 1963, with political cartoons that we have at the Center for Legislative Archives, and which you can get to in a few ways, but one of which is from the National Archives website. So the presentation is going to feature cartoons that were created by Clifford and Jim Berryman. They're a father and son team who drew every day for the Evening Star, which was then the biggest newspaper in Washington, D.C. Clifford started in 1907 with the Star, and Jim retired in 1963. So from like 1907 to 1963, there was a Berryman on almost every front page of the Evening Star. And these images depict major issues of the Cold War, and they're student-friendly educational resources because you can use them to teach about history and you can use them to build critical thinking skills. So I'm going to talk about them, like how do you teach history with this stuff? How do you teach critical thinking skills with these kind of images? And as you know, in the TEKS, they give a lot of attention to the Cold War. They want to talk about significant national and international decisions and conflicts in the Cold War. And they want the students to be able to talk about how the U.S. responded to Soviet aggression after World War II in a variety of ways, which we'll mention in this PowerPoint: Truman Doctrine, NATO, Berlin Airlift, and so on. Then we're going to talk about Cold War tensions at home with the McCarthyism and the House version of that, which was the Un-American Activities Committee. And then we'll talk about the Korean War. This presentation is going to end at 1963, so we will not get into Vietnam. And so it's part of the Cold War. But I think that it lays the groundwork for what you could teach in, the full unit. But it is, I just want to be clear up front that it's, 1946 to 1963. I'm going to show you a lot of cartoons. I'm going to do what I wouldn't advise you to do with your students, and that is to show you a lot of cartoons and talk about them fast. The reason that I feel okay doing this is because I'm also providing you with a copy of this PowerPoint, and all these cartoons are available in a free ebook that we have on our website. And the address for that ebook is right on the screen there. You see archives.gov, legislative resources, ebooks. It's called A Visual History, 1940 to 1963, Political Cartoons by Clifford and Jim Berryman. So I drew primarily from that book in putting together this PowerPoint. Now, to understand the Cold War, you have to see it as one chapter in a bigger story. It's the bigger story of the relationship of the United States to the world. So if we dial back to the late 19th century, what we see is that throughout the 19th century, U.S. foreign policy has been guided by the Monroe Doctrine. It's been focused on the Western Hemisphere, and it's been largely anti-colonial in spirit. But in 1898, the United States came to a crossroads. And would the United States choose to remain on the path of the Monroe Doctrine and be largely isolated from larger global actions? Or would the United States engage in the age of imperialism that was then kind of unfolding around it? Well, America didn't make a decisive decision. It debated its role in the world from 1918 to 1941. At times, many times, the United States aspired to be neutral. At other times, the United States was a global leader. So if you want to understand the Cold War, you have to see it in that larger context. And we have a book that'll help you do that. We have political cartoons for teaching foreign policy from 1898 to 1940 in this free ebook. There's 63 cartoons in that one, America and the World. So that will give you tools that you can use if you want to just acquaint your kids with the larger story of American foreign policy in a kid-friendly way. But let's just look at a couple of moments in that larger 1898 to 1945 time period. Critically, we go to 1918, and President Woodrow Wilson's World War I leadership has enabled him to espouse this 14-point peace plan in which a peaceful world would be founded on an international organization called the League of Nations. And this is going to direct post-war attention on the U.S. in a way that hasn't been seen before and really bring the U.S. to the pinnacle of its global influence to date. And so this cartoon from October of 1918 shows, the White House surrounded by clouds with some kind of otherworldly light shining on it, signifying that international attention. So it's the end of the war, and the United States is really among the more powerful countries standing at the end of World War I. The question is, what would the role of America be in this post-war world? And so this was like a moment for like charting new courses in international relations. As you see in this cartoon, which was published in 1919, the militarism that started World War I has been shackled. But there's a new danger that the Russian Revolution has unleashed, and you see it in that wild picture of Bolshevism. So what role would the US play in this era? Would the US play the role of civilization that you see personified as a woman with a sword and shield? Is that what we would be? This internationalist power kind of policing the world? If you look at Wilson's aspirations in the 14 points, clearly he thought the United States had a global role to play. But that was not to be. When the Treaty of Versailles came to the US Senate, it was rejected. And here you see the poor treaty on the run, at least Article 10 of it, this cartoon published in October of 1920. By that time, the Senate had rejected the treaty. Now, it's really important to bear in mind why they rejected it. They denounced US participation in the League of Nations. They did not want the US committed to an international organization. They did not want US troops committed to combat because of treaties. They wanted decisions about war to be made by the US Congress, as they have been traditionally made. So the voters agreed that in the return to normalcy, the treaty was rejected. And for like the next 20 years, the US is going to reject internationalism in its foreign policy. And so from 1920 to 1941, US foreign policy is based in neutrality and relies on international agreements limiting arms sales and renouncing war to keep the peace. But these idealistic hopes are shattered in the 1930s when Hitler and other militant authoritarians emerge, take power, and threaten to start a new world war. And this cartoon you see on the screen now is published just a week before the start of World War II. And the caption of it was, "It's a great act, but it's tough on the spectators." And so like using cartoons like these, you can kind of give the kids snapshots that show them the posture of the US with respect to the rest of the world. This cartoon you see on the screen now was published just before the fall of France, a couple of days before the Germans marched into Paris. Well, in the 1930s, Italy had invaded Ethiopia, 1935. Japan had invaded China, 1937. Germany and Russia divided Poland in 1939, and France fell to a German invasion in 1940. But America clung to neutrality behind its defensive wall and did not see itself as getting involved in those disputes, because until the attack on Pearl Harbor, America denied the international peril that it faced. Congress was dominated by internationalists who prized neutrality in the face of danger and resisted President Franklin Roosevelt's call for preparedness. So all the cartoons I showed you up to this point are in the ebook America and the World. The rest of them are from the other book of visual history. Okay. Well, anyway, spurred into action by the attack on Pearl Harbor, America followed President Roosevelt's lead and made unprecedented sacrifices and fought a global war on the Axis powers. 4 years of total war and the use of horrific weapons of mass destruction finally ended the danger, and victory was achieved in 1945. Okay, Europe's future was decided at the Yalta meetings held in 1945, with the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met to discuss the shape of Europe and the future of the continent. Now, this cartoon is, I think, one of the most powerful ones, but it really sets the stage for the Cold War. Because on the anniversary of D-Day, the cartoon asks, what does America owe those who fell in the war? Should America retreat into isolation as it had after World War I, or was the U.S. obliged to shape the future? And just after that, a few weeks after that cartoon was published, this idea of America and the world is going to be transformed by the founding of the United Nations. And the charter of it is signed, and it's a very Wilsonian document. It's embodying the 14 points that he used as the basis for the Treaty of Versailles. And as you can see, that the first bullet there, they're going to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought about untold sorrow to mankind. And I'm going to move ahead and say, yeah, well, all that was going on. Yalta was deciding the shape of Europe. The United Nations is being formed. But for the American people, after the Great Depression and now 5 years of war, they're ready to get involved with consumer spending. They want the gasoline, tires, clothes, jobs that they've been denied throughout the war. And so this cartoon, Fill Her Up, was published 2 days after the surrender of the Japanese. Okay, back to peace, back to enjoyment. But there are some questions that remain, one of which was, what will the U.S. military posture be like after the war? You know, after World War I, they wanted to scrap the military and go back to neutrality. What about after World War II? And here you see a discussion about how big of a Navy should we have in this 1945 cartoon. And the question that's raised is, well, how many atomic bombs will cover the oceans? You know, should we rely on the atomic bomb or should we rely on conventional weapons? Because we have a monopoly on the bomb. We're going into the post-war world as the only superpower left. And so what will this be like? Will it be a period of peace? Will it be a period of neutrality where we kind of focus on living the good life? But that illusion that it would be a period of peace was shattered in early 1946 when Winston Churchill gave a speech that's known as the Iron Curtain speech. And he talks about how from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, Eastern Europe is falling under the dominance of the Soviet Union. What can the US do about this? This is the start of the Cold War, responding to this awakening. Hey, the Soviets are not living up to the Yalta agreements. In fact, they're involved in aggression. How will the US respond? Are we committed, because of Soviet action, to an internationalist policy? Basically, are we in a situation where we can't afford to go back to the isolationism and neutrality after World War I? So this takes us into this anxious age in the post-war world. And so what I'm going to do is try to show you, and again, it's going to be very fast, but I want to walk you through 17 years of the Cold War and show you how it looked to the people who were alive then. Using newspaper cartoons, you're showing the first draft of history. And so by immersing people in the first draft of history, you can kind of see it as it happened. It is going to be a little bit hard to follow this because I'm going to go chronologically and there's a lot going on. So what I did is I tagged each slide according to these tags here, according to the 7 sources of conflict. And as I go through, what I want you to see is how in any year, there are different conflicts emerging, almost like within 10 days of each other from opposite sides of the world. So I want you to look at these cartoons as if you were alive back then, if you're an American seeing this stuff unfolding. And I want you to try to imagine what you would be feeling. Because when we talk about it as an age of anxiety, that's kind of like a historian title that kind of, you know, covers it in amber. But when you kind of put yourself immersed in this primary source set, you really see how scary it was to be alive back then. So we'll start in 1946, and what we see is, you know, the Soviets have control over Eastern Europe, but are they going to try to expand their hegemony into the West? And this cartoon, published in August of that year, shows Stalin meddling in Greece and trying to support a communist takeover in Greece. This is like our part of Europe. This is the Western half of Europe. Are we going to just let this happen? How will the US respond? And so this is really the first big challenge of the Cold War. And so the next year, the US will respond with a speech from President Truman, which is a real critical foundation of foreign policy going forward. It's called the Truman Doctrine. And the one paragraph we'll take a moment and look at is the one with the red star next to it. Truman said, "The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world. We shall surely endanger the welfare of our own nation. We don't have the luxury of going back to the isolation that we took on after World War I. Truman says, we're engaged in this business of maintaining democracy and freedom around the world, really, whether we like it or not. And so where that leaves John Q. Public is shown in this 1947 cartoon. Maybe he was worried about getting a new car, maybe worried about inflation. But Truman is saying, no, no, no. We also have to take on communism in Europe. Hey, but we just finished that war. Yeah, but the conflict goes on. And the little guy in the cartoon says, you mean I can't take them on one at a time? And I think that this really shows the beginning of this Cold War anxiety over the conflict in Europe. We thought we won the war. We thought we were finished, but we're not finished. But at the same time, it's not just Europe. Okay, so here's where you get that notion of how in any year there's different anxiety coming from different directions. We also have the fear of subversion in the US. What if movie makers are communists? What if they're using the movies to spread communist propaganda? And this is the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is in the TEEX, subpoena of leading movie makers. And I put stars next to three of them just because, we could talk about the whole list, but Charlie Chaplin, Walt Disney, and some guy named Ronald Reagan, whom we'll hear from later. But are communists using movies to spread propaganda? Well, Leela Rogers, who is the mother of Ginger Rogers, testified that yes, they were. And in fact, the movie None But the Lonely is a splendid example of communist propaganda in the movie industry. So Americans are worried the Russians are causing trouble in Europe, and the movies are perhaps causing trouble at home. But you look at cartoons and you want to treat political cartoons as if they're objective history. But I use this cartoon to alert you to the fact that they're biased, they're prejudiced. And here you see one by Jim Berryman, and he shows this woman who's delighted that Congress is going to take on the movies because she's thrilled that they'll be, talking to her favorite stars. And I think the sexism and the sort of male chauvinism of that image really show you two things. The past is a foreign country, I hope. And the other thing is that you really have to take all these cartoons with a big grain of salt, because Berryman's were people with opinions. We're worried about this domestic communism. What should we do? Should we make them register? And there was legislation in 1948 sponsored by Richard Nixon and Carl Mundt from North Dakota saying that communists should be required to register with the government. And this is a Berryman cartoon about that legislation. That legislation didn't pass, but 2 years later, the Nixon-McCarran Internal Security Act did require communists to register with the government. And so that's kind of a statement of limiting First Amendment rights and really forcing people whose opinions are perhaps dangerous to make themselves known to the government. Well, we had so far talking about conflict in Europe and domestic communism at home. A whole nother area of conflict is going to emerge in 1948, and that's the Middle East. And this cartoon is the merry-go-round. It's labeled Palestine Policy. And this time around, what is Harry Truman riding? Which horse? Ultimately, President Truman, to many people's surprise, recognized the state of Israel that was establishing itself within Palestine. And so the U.S. now is on the side of Israel, and immediately the first Arab-Israeli war erupts. This is not part of the Cold War now, but I put this in here because within a few years, the Middle East conflict is going to be kind of a proxy war of the Cold War powers, where the Russians are going to support the Arabs and the U.S. is going to support Israel. But 1948 is the start of that. But we don't have time, Americans, to worry about that conflict in the Middle East, because just at about the same time, the Russians have blockaded their part of Germany. As you know, Germany was divided after the war. And so the Americans, the British, they have the western half of Germany and the Russians have the eastern half. And what happens in June of 1948 is that the Soviets blockade their half. All right, what are we going to do? Are we just going to let Berlin fall to the Russians? And so we respond in two ways. They do an airlift, the US and the UK, to supply Berlin. But secondly, they form NATO. And this is another thing that's in the TEEX. But here's the NATO treaty. And these are notes from Secretary of State Dean Acheson. And he talks about why they started NATO on this page. If you want to see the whole thing, I gave you the NARA ID number there. You put that in our catalog, and it's about 27 pages long. But you can see that because of the Soviet aggressiveness against Greece, Turkey, and Czechoslovakia, we feel that we have to make this military alliance. I want to point to this because after World War I, we rejected the Treaty of Versailles because we didn't want to be in a post-war military alliance. Here we are in a post-war military alliance. So it's a real break with where America was in previous times. We have the monopoly of the bomb, though, and so we can rely on that. It's 1949. As long as you don't tell Stalin and that secret doesn't get out, America can be protected by having the ultimate weapon. But in 1949, much to our alarm, President Truman reports that the Russians also have their own bomb. And so that's going to add to the tension because we have a bomb, the Russians have a bomb. And so we don't have the upper hand on them, but also this notion of mutually assured destruction is emerging. So about a week later, it gets worse because in addition to worrying about do the Russians have the bomb, we're worried about the Chinese revolution because the Chinese have the communists have won that revolution. And so Chiang Kai-shek and his non-communist party are forced off the mainland, and Mao Zedong and the Communist Party are now taking over. How will the U.S. respond to that? We just allowed communism to expand. Should we have been fighting in Asia to stop that? Well, we're now like committed to defending Chiang, and so he's on the island of Formosa off the coast, and we have this kind of two China policy. And so from 1949 to 1953, Chiang is on Formosa saying he's going to go back and reconquer the mainland, and we have a navy in the middle to keep him from doing that. And so this is a real kind of superpower standoff, and it's adding to the tension that people are feeling because you've got the problems in Europe where we're trying to contain the spread of communism, and now we've got the problem in Asia. And we're also going to have a problem of outright war happening, and this is going to be a real paradigm shift for America. And so let's take a look at it. In June of 1950, U.S. forces are called upon to defend Korea. And I want to show you a few cartoons related to this. And I want you to notice this. This is the newspaper. And so you can see, you know, big, bold headline, U.S. forces to defend Korea. Okay. Now, up until this time, when U.S. forces were involved in defending anything, especially things away from the United States, they were there because of a vote of Congress. But remember, after World War I, they said, we don't want troops committed because of a treaty. Now, for the first time, you have U.S. troops committed to a shooting war because of a treaty. And Congress didn't vote. In fact, Congress was informed about the fact that the U.S. troops would be fighting in Korea by a press release issued by President Truman. And here's an excerpt from this press release. And he talks about, you know, in pursuance of a treaty, I have ordered the United States Air and Sea Forces to give Korean government troops cover and support. And so this is a new departure for the United States in terms of its foreign policy. And it's a huge departure constitutionally in terms of the president and his war-making powers. So that sets the paradigm for what we know today, where presidents order troops into foreign combat. It didn't happen prior to that. Now, I don't know how much of this PowerPoint I will get through in the limited time that we have, but I do want to show you this and a couple other slides to really give you a sense of where we're going. Using the newspaper to get kids to understand the situation like the Cold War really immerses them in it. And this one is just a random day in July of 1950. But what I like about it is that it shows the different kinds of anxiety that are facing America in this moment, because the green headline is about conflicts in Asia. And you can see that we have American troops fighting in Korea. Okay. The red star refers to conflicts in Europe. And in this Jim Berryman cartoon, we have Joseph Stalin with a box of matches, and he's lighting the fires that are the Korean conflict and the Indochina conflict. And Uncle Sam is the global fireman going to put these fires out. Just below that cartoon, you've got the head of the United Auto Workers saying the U.S. has to commit to a 100-year-long, trillion-dollar fight to stop the spread of communism. And then you got two stories with the orange stars that are related to domestic fears of subversion. Over on the right, you've got one where the Dawes Committee has denounced Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy had said there were communists in the State Department. So the Dawes Committee investigated, and they said McCarthy was a fraud and a hoax, but McCarthy's not going to go anywhere. And over on the left, you got this really interesting story. How did the Russians get the bomb? Well, it's a story about the arrest of a guy named Julius Rosenberg, who was a scientist who, as you know, he and his wife will be executed soon after for giving atomic secrets to the Russians. So all that is on one day's newspaper, and you could get all that anxiety for 5 cents, which I think really immerses you in what the Cold War was about. But the cartoons that Berryman drew are wonderful. This one, you know, he drew when in 1953, the British and the Americans are trying to make a truce. And the leader of South Korea says, no, we want to keep fighting. And I think that, you know, it really shows how crazy it was when you've got these wars where you go into to fight with these allies, but then you're sort of like a hostage to their own local interests and desires. Um, the Cold War isn't just military. It's also, there's a lot of ideological conflict. And so this one is about the speech that President Eisenhower gave in 1953 saying, okay, you guys have the nuclear bomb, we have the nuclear bomb, we should use these to build a peaceful world. And, you know, he shows, Berryman draws a juxtaposition where the Kremlin is denouncing the U.S. as warmongers and the U.S. is calling to use atomic energy to build a peaceful world. And so I think that gives the kids a sense of this hope that we could find a peaceful way to avoid conflict. I want to move quickly into the next year, 1954, because here we have a real circus with Senator McCarthy accusing the Army of having communists involved in it, and the Army accusing him back of trying to get favorable treatment for one of his staff members. I like this cartoon. It's not one that we have, but it's one that I got from the Library of Congress. It's a Jim Berryman cartoon that was in the Evening Star. And why I like it is because it shows Committee Chair Carl Mundt chasing the Army committee hearings around, trying to get them under control. And why I like this is because it adds a dimension. It's about the fear of subversion, but it's also about the emerging popularity of television. The Army McCarthy hearings dominated television in the spring of 1954. And so for many people, the Cold War came into their living room, and the anxiety of the Cold War came into their living room as they followed the committee hearings on TV. McCarthy went too far, and he was censured by the Senate for his conduct in those committees. And so I have the censure resolution here for you, and I gave you the NARA identification numbers on this slide. You can't see it from this projection, but you can have the kids look at that and talk about why did they censure McCarthy, and they said it's because he was of his conduct unbecoming of a member of the United States Senate and contrary to senatorial traditions. But there's a wonderful cartoon about this. And McCarthy was taken to the woodshed, according to this Berryman cartoon from 1954 with the censure. And I want to just point out that McCarthy wasn't finished, however, because that was in December of 1954. And in 1955, in January of that year, McCarthy is going to accuse the Army of harboring a communist dentist. And so we have this wonderful Cold War cartoon, kind of gets at the fear of subversion in America because are there communists in the Army? And really, it's also about McCarthy because, you know, he went to the woodshed with the censure, but he's not going to go quietly. He accuses the Secretary of the Army of covering up this incident. And of course, the Army secretary had to resign. And so McCarthy kind of took him with him. And so it's that tit for tat polemic politics of the 50s that kind of intensified the Cold War feeling. Now, I think this is one of the most interesting cartoons of the Cold War because, you know, we had this business of atoms for peace. We've had different aspirations to end the arms race. But, you know, the problem the United States has, can you trust the Russians? And this is the cartoon I'm going to ask you to look at in the small group breakout, but it was from 1955. And, you know, it really dramatizes Uncle Sam's position where, no, can we trust those guys? Or do we have to keep building our military infrastructure? Because if we don't, they're going to stab us in the back, as they did after Yalta. So the Mideast became a tension of proxy war. It was in 1955. And, you know, the basic story is if the Russians are selling arms to the Palestinians and the Americans are selling arms to the Israelis, is that going to intensify the likelihood of a shooting war? And as you know, there was a big war in 1956 in the Middle East. And so here you see World Peace saying, I thought I had an appointment at that foreign ministers meeting. One of the reasons there wasn't maybe a World War III in the 50s was because of the United Nations. And this cartoon was published on the 10th anniversary of the United Nations. The United Nations kind of gets a bad rap today. A lot of people are critical of it. But, you know, if you think about it, it was the forum where the tensions of the Cold War, the ideological conflicts were hashed out. And so I think it played a huge role in keeping, you know, superpower conflict from happening. There were lots of little wars in the 50s around the periphery of the spheres of influence of the major powers, but there wasn't like a World War III, I think, because of the United Nations. And so I think this cartoon is a good one to get the kids to look at and have them think about, you know, what's the look on his face mean, and so on. Um, there's a couple of cartoons I'm just going to show you quickly. Here's one. In the mid 50s, one of the aspirations the Germans had was to reunify. And of course, the Soviets are not going to let them do that because they're worried about how powerful a reunited Germany would be. And I want to just skip ahead to show you one that's related to that. Another one about negotiations was the Geneva meetings in 1955. The US and Eisenhower hoped they could get a peaceful end to the Cold War. And so they thought they would have this thing of sort of aerial surveillance of each other's weapons systems and kind of a negotiated period of trust. But because of the German wish to reunify, the Soviets became very cold toward that idea. And so in this cartoon, you see how the hammer and sickle is acting to block out the spirit of Geneva, and it's called Eclipse. Is that cartoon. And by the way, as I'm going so quickly through these cartoons to show you a lot of them, in the notes pane of each of these slides is a lot of historical context on these cartoons. So if you go back to this PowerPoint later, you can read an awful lot about these cartoons, and that same information is in the ebook. But I want to show you this very dramatic year of 1956. Technology has been seen as being, a blessing, that it makes the world better, makes life easier and all that. But the Cold War and the atomic bomb was maybe the first time in history where technology became the danger, where technology became the enemy. And one of the first people to point out how dangerous nuclear technology was Adlai Stevenson. And this cartoon is from the presidential election of 1956. And so here it's a Cold War tension because of the idea that, well, technology isn't all good. It's really a mixed bag. And he seized upon the H-bomb issue, and he declared that universal disarmament was the first order of business in the world today. And he argued that, look, we have enough bombs, that we need to work out an international test ban treaty. But the public just wasn't interested. And so the ban the bomb movement and stuff will come a couple of years later. But you can see Stevenson trying to get the American public to get their minds around the idea that nuclear weapons are a great danger to the future of the planet and humanity. And so that cartoon kind of, with its crazy bomb path, looks like Slim Pickens at the end of Dr. Strangelove, if you've ever seen that film. Really kind of gives you a dramatic sense. But I think this is the most dramatic cartoon I have. And this one is about an incident that I don't know if you teach. It's about the Hungarian uprising in 1956. So it's the same time as that H-bomb cartoon was published, just a week later. And it's just before the presidential election in the US. In October of 56, the people of Hungary revolt against their Soviet kind of puppet state that rules the country. And for a brief time, it looks like, they're going to be able to overthrow this, but not so fast. The Russians on November 4th launch a surprise attack and just crush the uprising and set up a pro-Soviet government that cracks down on all dissent. Well, then in December 4th, thousands of women march out in protest and confront Russian tanks. And so Berryman captures that in this image, the women of Hungary, and you see the Russian tanks. And the caption is, "This wouldn't stand inspection." And, that refers back to that notion of mutual trust and using flyovers to inspect each other's military equipment. He says that ain't going to happen. And so it's a real point, because should the US have gotten involved in the Hungarian Revolution and supporting the Hungarian Revolution? Well, it sounds like a good idea, but the problem is dramatized in this cartoon from just the next year. NATO relied upon nuclear weapons. And, so because of that, the Soviets have a tremendous advantage in conventional forces because they're right there and their numbers of forces are so great. So can the US get involved in stopping things like, the Russian suppression of freedom in Hungary? Because to do that, we would have to rely on nuclear weapons. And do we want to go there? And so really, you kind of are handicapped. Your strength becomes a weakness because NATO has the nuclear retaliation warnings that they could give. But if you actually use those weapons, it hurts you as much as it hurts your adversaries. And so, it's kind of a strange standoff, but this cartoon gets at that mutually assured destruction problem, because you've got the Hungary cartoon and this one happening, right after each other. One of the things that lowered the tension about technology was moving testing underground. And this wonderful cartoon shows underground A-bomb testing, and it says a fella isn't safe anywhere anymore. And I find that kids kind of get a kick out of this one. It's kind of hokey, but it does kind of make its point. And you know, that notion of test bomb treaties are going to be a big deal in 1963 when the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom and the US signed a limited test ban treaty, and they're going to pledge to conduct all nuclear tests underground. At the same time, in 1957, that technology is moving underground. It's also moving into space. All right. The problem of the nuclear bomb is that one nuclear bomb can ruin your whole day. Their destructive capacity is just unbelievable. Well, what if you could put a nuclear bomb on a rocket? Then you could launch a nuclear bomb from the Soviet Union that would hit a target in the United States in a matter of minutes, and you'd really have no defense against this. Well, the same technology that puts a rocket into space is the same technology that would put a nuclear warhead into the United States from the Soviet Union. So this race to get an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, has been going on since World War II. And in 1957, the Soviets shocked the US because they demonstrated that they could launch a rocket into space. And they launched a satellite called Sputnik. And this was one of the most shocking things to happen in the whole Cold War, because now America feels they're falling behind. And you can see the nervous scientists in this observatory, and it says, "Do not disturb men watching." So this is going to kick off the space race, which, you know, right now is still happening with China landing a space vehicle on the moon just the other day. But from this Sputnik, we now fall further behind because the Soviets launched a dog into space in 1957, and this Berryman cartoon captures that. The caption is, "It shouldn't happen to a dog," and it's about the dog Laika, who is launched into space. And so falling behind, what are we going to do? But we don't have time to worry about that, because it's 1958 and we're worried about the Middle East as well. So we've got all these things going on, and you've got the Soviets seasoning the Middle East pot, and you have Arab nationalism as this emerging force under Gamal Abdel Nasser, and you have Khrushchev giving, you know, military aid to him, and Nasser has linked Egypt and Syria, and he overthrows the king of Iraq and destabilizes Jordan and Lebanon. Is he going to put together the old Ottoman Empire? Oof, that would destabilize the whole balance of power. So the U.S. lands forces in Lebanon, the British land forces in Jordan, and many people are worried that this could be a bigger war that's going to come out of this. Now, from here on, all of the conflict in the Middle East is going to be a proxy for the Cold War, with the Russians very actively supporting the Arabs and the Americans very actively supporting the Israelis. But again, that's going on. But at the same time, it's 1958. And so we've got to now turn our attention to China, because, you know, the Republicans have been accusing Democrats of having lost China in 1949 because the communists took over. Well, here it is, 1958. We've got a Republican administration, and the Chinese are making really overt threats against Taiwan. They're bombing islands called Quemoy and Matsu, which are off the coast of China. And how will the U.S. respond? The communists are attacking our allies, our non-communist allies. Will we get involved in a war? And cooler heads prevail. U.S. Defense Secretary John Foster Dulles calls for a ceasefire. And for the first time, the U.S. recognizes that, okay, there are two Chinas. And we're going to return to that in just a moment. Space is this like metaphor for which country is ahead. And so with this cartoon from 1958, you can show the U.S. kind of making a comeback and how proud they were of having launched, you know, a real rocket, they said. But I want to move on and finish with the 1960 to 1963. I have a couple of cartoons here that I think are kind of worth looking at. Yeah, we worried about communism in Asia. We worried about communism in Europe. 1960, we're worried about communism in the Western Hemisphere, about 100 miles off Florida. And this cartoon by Berryman was published at a time when the communist leader of, newly installed communist leader in Cuba, was threatening the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo, which is on the island. And it's just a couple of days before the Nixon-Kennedy election in 1960. And you can see Eisenhower, who's still president, says that the U.S. will defend the base. And you know, the question of U.S. policy versus Cuba is going to get very intense, but this is really the start of the saber rattling by both sides. But there's a whole new dimension in terms of ideology. There was the kitchen debate in the late 50s, and this notion that, Khrushchev is going to lead the Soviet Union to build a workers' paradise. He says he's going to bury the United States. And in 1960, he says he's going to have, 1961, excuse me, utopia by 1980. And you can see Berryman's skeptical response. Khrushchev announces new dramatic plan for a communist utopia, and the Russian worker, weighed down by communism with that hammer and sickle over his shoulder, says, I don't think I can make it. So I think what this shows is that, with these cartoons, they're constructed images, and there's all kinds of layers of suggestion in them. So getting the kids to piece them apart and say, okay, but how does it mean that? And why does it mean that? And what are all the elements I have to think about? This is kind of a simple one, but it does have a lot of layers of historical information in it that you can teach, critical thinking by taking it apart. The ideological conflict seems like it's going down. We got a new president. Is this a new chance to end the Cold War? And in a meeting in Vienna in June of 1961, Kennedy says some hopeful things. He says, in these difficult times, special obligations rest with the chairman, Khrushchev, and the president of the United States, that they should fulfill their duty with regard to the people of their country in a way that would avoid direct conflict. And so it seems like we're moving back from the brink. But I wanted to also give you this image, once top secret map, showing that in 1962 we are back to the brink because we discover Russian missiles in Cuba, and that introduces the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for my last slide, blackballing Red China at the United Nations. The two China policy has a recognition that the communists control the mainland and the non-communists control the island of Formosa, but only non-communist China has a seat in the UN. And every year, the US leads its non-communist allies to blackball the Chinese application for membership. So I know this was fast, and I know it was a lot of cartoons, but I hope that you can go back to this PowerPoint and treat it like a buffet and mine it for those 2 or 3 images that you can bring into your classroom. Again, all the cartoons are available in this free ebook, and they'll walk you, through other topics as well, such as civil rights and science of the 1950s. But there's my email, and so if you have any questions and you want to get in touch with me, please don't hesitate to send me an email. Okay, Jeremy, I'm done.
Fantastic.